Good evening. Welcome in the calm silence of your space. Between light blankets and slowing breathing, let's dive into an ancient story. One of those that carry dust, sweat, and deep sadness. Today, we'll walk through the journey of Hercules and the 12 Labors. But don't expect fast-paced action or perfect heroes. What comes next is more shadow than glory, more doubt than certainty. If this narrative brings you a little peace, if it touches some hidden corner of your night, then yes, like, comment, or subscribe, but only if it makes sense to you. Now, take a deep breath. If you can, turn off the lights. Put your cell phone aside. You don't have to watch, just listen. Let the images form on their own and travel with your own thoughts. Leave the rest to me. Before he was a myth, Hercules was a man. He was born as Alcides, but he was given the name Heracles, a cruel irony, a forced tribute to the goddess Hera, who hated him with all her might. The bastard son of Zeus, he grew up under the constant persecution of this goddess. As a baby, he crushed 2 snakes that Hera sent to kill him. He survived, and from that moment on, he lived with a strength that the world did not know how to contain. In his youth, he tried to be instructed in music, weapons, and philosophy, but he was indomitable. In a fit of rage, he killed one of his teachers simply for being corrected. Cast out, he withdrew into seclusion. For a brief time, he knew peace. He married Megara, had children, and built a home. But Hera, true to her grudge, unleashed a fit of madness upon him. In a hallucinatory state, Hercules killed Megara and her children. When he came to, he was surrounded by blood, of the woman he loved, of the children he had borne. There was no excuse, only pain. With his soul crushed, he sought guidance from the Oracle of Delphi. The answer was clear. To purify his crime, he must serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae, complete the labors he imposed. Hercules did not argue, nor did he resist. He simply obeyed, because there was nothing left to preserve. Eurystheus, a coward and manipulator, saw in the god's order a chance to get rid of the hero. He created impossible tasks, each one more absurd than the last, things that no common man would dare attempt. 12 challenges designed to kill. But Hercules, already without hope, accepted. Not for glory, not for redemption, just to move forward. The first test took him to Nemea, a dry valley with low hills and rough vegetation. The region was terrorized by a gigantic lion, whose skin could not be pierced by weapons. It was said that he devoured flocks, hunters, women, and children. No one came near the cave where he slept except him. Hercules arrived on foot, without armor, without a sword, with only a staff and his own body. He followed abandoned trails, observing deep footprints in the dry mud. The silence of the place was heavy. The air smelled of bones, of old things that no longer wanted to be remembered. When he found the entrance to the cave, he did not hesitate. He faced the darkness, took a deep breath, and entered. The first job was about to begin. The smell was the first warning, a thick, dense stench that stuck in the throat like ancient dust. The Nemean lion's cave was no place of ambush or hunting. It was an open tomb. The floor was strewn with bones, some whole, some crushed. There were bits of rusted armor, broken bows, spears gnawed like twigs. It all said the same thing. No one had returned. Hercules did not stop. He entered slowly, with his staff firmly in his hands. His eyes needed time to adjust to the darkness, but his ears did not. The silence inside was absolute. No wind, no insects, only a heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from the back of the cave. He knew it was the lion, and the lion knew he was there. The roar was not immediate. The animal, the size of a bull, stepped out of the shadows like a living shadow. It had amber eyes, and fur that looked like it was made of bronze. Its claws were as thick as scythes. It was clear this was not just an animal, it was a mistake in the world, a reminder that there are forces that exist only to devour. Hercules struck first. His staff hit the creature's side with enough force to knock down a wall, but the sound was strange. No dull impact. It was as if he had hit moss-covered stone. The creature didn't even flinch. It just bristled, and then it leapt. The fight was brutal, fast. No tactics, no elegance. Hercules barely dodged, rolled on the dirt floor, hit it with his staff, and watched the wood snap like a toothpick. He tried to use a dagger. The blade broke against the monster's fur. He tried to push it against a rock, but was thrown back with the force of an earthquake. It was clear. Weapons would not work here. Hercules then did the unthinkable. He let go of everything. He waited for the lion to advance and grabbed it, arms against paws, chest against jaw. A fight without tools, just flesh, muscle, and desperation. Every movement tore skin, dislocated bone, cut off air. The lion tried to bite, scratch, crush, but Hercules held on tight. He used his own arms as a trap. He squeezed with everything. He squeezed until the beast's eyes rolled back, until its neck snapped. When the body fell, silence returned, but it was a different silence now. One that left room for tiredness, for fear, for the pain that had not yet arrived. Hercules, covered in blood and scratches, sat down next to the corpse. He breathed as if trying to remember that he was still alive. He looked at the animal, so strong, so unbeatable, so dead. He felt no pride, no relief, just a slight strangeness, as if, by defeating the monster, he had killed a part of himself. There, deep in that forgotten cave, it became clear. The first labor was more than a struggle. It was a warning. There would be more and more difficult, more and more lonely, and none of them would bring forgiveness. As he left the cave, he carried the lion's body on his shoulders. The villagers watched in silence. No one applauded. No one came near. It was as if they saw not a hero, but an omen, a man who attracts terrible things. The next night, alone by a campfire, Hercules tried to use the lion's skin as a cloak, but no knife could cut it. He tried fire. Nothing. Then he remembered his own fight, the beast's claws, and he used one of them as a blade. It worked. The skin gave way. Thick, resistant, perfect to wear. And that's what he did. From then on, he began to carry in his body the memory of what he had faced, not as a trophy, but as armor, as if the only way to move forward was to gradually become like that which he had defeated. The second labor was even more uncomfortable, not because of the creature's size, but because of the environment in which it lived. The Lernaean Hydra lived in a swamp, a deep, muddy marsh, surrounded by a mist that never seemed to dissipate. The banks were dry, but the center, that was treacherous. Each step could sink someone up to their chest, and if the body remained, fear completed the job. The creature was familiar. It had several heads, all poisonous, and a slimy body that was impossible to stick swords into. The worst part? Every time a head was cut off, two would grow in its place. A circular punishment, a curse that was never meant to end. It was like facing your own anxiety. The more you try to rip it off, the more it comes back. Hercules approached the marsh, cautiously. It smelled of rot. The trees around it had hollow trunks, as if they were screaming in silence. No animal sounds, no birdsong, only the sound of thick water moving slowly. The Hydra appeared unhurriedly. It crawled out of the slime like a liquid nightmare. 9 heads bobbed in the air. Each had different eyes. Some seemed to watch with curiosity, others with pure hatred. None hesitated. They attacked in unison. Hercules tried to fight as he always did, by cutting, and indeed, it was effective. At first, one head would fall, but two would spring up, more agile, more ferocious. Within minutes, he was surrounded, retreating, sweating cold. The staff only pushed, the sword cut, but it made things worse. It was a cycle of futile fury. That was when Iolaus appeared, young, loyal, watching from afar. He ran to the fire they had built when they arrived. He pulled out a burning branch and shouted something. Hercules understood the gesture. He cut off another head, and Iolaus burned the stump before the new ones could grow. It worked, so, together, they began to turn the tables. One cut, the other burned. One by one, the nightmares fell. In the end, only the central head remained, larger, immortal. No flame would solve it. Hercules crushed it with a blow of a stone. Then he buried it under a heavy rock. Only then did the creature stop. But even in death, she left memories. The Hydra's blood was pure poison. Hercules dipped the tips of his arrows in it, knowing it would be useful or dangerous. Maybe both. The return was silent. Eurystheus, upon learning of the feat, hid inside a bronze jar, terrified at the thought of what Hercules was becoming. And yet, he announced, "This work does not count." Hercules had help. The king ruled, but the hero didn't argue. He didn't demand justice. He just breathed and waited for the next challenge. The third task was not about mythological monsters or sacred riddles. It was about running after something that runs faster for days, maybe weeks. It was the kind of task that doesn't seem deadly, but exhausts, not because of its apparent difficulty, but because of its persistence. It was the kind of ordeal that tested not just the body, but the patience, the mind, the faith. The target was the Erymanthian boar, a gigantic, wild animal with tusks as curved as scythes and unblinking eyes. It was said to live on the icy slopes of Mount Erymanthus, advancing on villages during the winter and destroying crops, granaries, everything in its path. But it did not attack out of hunger. It attacked for pleasure, or fear, or for no reason at all. It just attacked. Hercules set out early, before the sun rose. He carried only a thick cloak, a bow on his back, and some dry food. The path to the mountains was long, but familiar. The territory of centaurs, ancient creatures, half men and half horses, who were not always hostile. Some were old acquaintances, others not so much. On the way, he stopped at the cave of Pholus, a calmer centaur who knew the past and avoided fights. Pholus offered wine and hospitality. They talked. They laughed. For a moment, Hercules seemed like an ordinary person, but like everything in that life, the peace was brief. The wine opened by Pholus was sacred, reserved for the centaurs. Soon, others appeared, drunk, angry, thinking that Hercules was stealing. A riot formed, and as almost always happened around him, it turned into tragedy. Bows were raised, spears were thrown. Hercules tried to hold back, but he fought back. He wounded, he killed, and in the end, Pholus died too, by accident. As he tried to examine an arrow, it fell from his hands and poisoned him. It was one of the arrows dipped in the Hydra's blood. Hercules buried Pholus there, in silence. Then he headed for the mountain, without rushing, without sleep, with his head full of guilt that I no longer knew where it came from. He climbed through the snow, the cutting winds, the dry branches, and soon he saw the tracks. The boar had passed by there. The marks in the frozen mud, deep and wide, said that the animal was bigger than anyone could have imagined. Following the trail was the easy part. The hard part was the sound, a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. When the boar emerged from the trees, it looked like a furry demon, Its eyes were red. Its tusks curved upward, like hooks ready to rip. And it ran, not out of fear, out of impulse. The chase began, deep into the forest. Branches snapped. Snow flew. Hercules ran after a monster that moved as if it were weightless. It was pure speed. He couldn't miss a step. The ground was slippery, the ravines treacherous. One slip, and he would be buried right there, under the snow and oblivion. But Hercules was not made to give up. He studied the patterns. He understood the curve of the footprints, the pauses in the animal's breathing. He knew when it stopped to rest. He knew when it prepared to attack. It was a game of endurance, not strength. After hours, or perhaps a days, time was vague there. He succeeded. He lured the boar to a high, slippery patch where the animal lost its balance. It rolled until it fell into a natural hole. Hercules climbed down. He jumped on it. He fought. He tied it with thick ropes. He didn't kill it, because this job called for capture, not execution. And so, he descended the mountain, pulling a snarling, struggling boar. It seemed impossible, and it was. But it happened. Upon arriving in Mycenae, Eurystheus saw the animal and was terrified. He ran into the bronze jar, where he hid whenever Hercules returned. He ordered the animal to be released into the most distant forests, far from everything. But the message was clear. With each task, the hero returned more hardened, more solitary, more efficient, more dangerous. In this work, there was no epic fight. There was no sword, only running, patience, and calculation. But that was exactly what made it crueler, because it required control, coldness, and Hercules was becoming exactly that, a creature who could handle everything, even when nothing else made sense. The fourth labor seemed at first glance a break, a relief. After killing monsters, braving swamps, and carrying wild boars, all that was left was to capture a doe. That was all. A delicate, agile animal, with golden horns and bronze hooves. The doe of Cyrenia, sacred to Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, untouchable. Untouchable by any man, even more so by a marked killer like Hercules. The mission was to capture her alive, without hurting her, without killing her. Just bring her back. It sounded almost kind, but it was precisely this requirement that made it all the more difficult, because it wasn't just a test of skill. It was a lesson in limits. Hercules, accustomed to crushing, tearing, and conquering through force, would now have to contain all of that. Be quick, without brutality. Hunt, without destroying. The search took almost a year. The doe was more than an animal. It was a constant escape, a reflection of everything Hercules had lost. Lightness, innocence, beauty. Every time he approached, she disappeared among the trees. Her hoof barely touched the ground. She seemed to run on mist. She passed through forests, crossed rivers, crossed hills like a breath of wind, and he followed her, without rest, without destination, like someone running after a memory that doesn't want to be remembered. During this time, Hercules saw seasons pass. He saw snow melt into clay. He saw flowers grow and die without a name. He slept under trees. He ate raw fruits, roots, whatever he could find. And he thought. He thought more than he wanted to, because in the absence of monsters, the enemy was memory. Sometimes he wondered what he was doing. Why keep going? What kind of redemption was there in capturing an animal that didn't even hurt anyone? But that was it. The work didn't have to make sense. It just had to get done. It was only at the end of summer that he found a real chance. The doe stopped near a calm lake, surrounded by mist. She drank water with gentle movements. Hercules approached silently, each step calculated, each breath held. She did not run away immediately. as if she felt something different at that moment, as if, perhaps, she was tired too. And then he acted, quickly, precisely. He used a light net, made of linen threads. He threw it over her carefully. The doe struggled, of course, but not with fear, with dignity, as if she knew her time to escape was over. Hercules tied it up with respect. He carried it as if it were a symbol, not a trophy. And so he descended back to the realm of men. On the way, he met someone he hadn't expected, Artemis herself, cold, elegant, with a bow on her back and an expressionless face. He asked her why she had touched a sacred being. Hercules didn't lie. He told the truth. He spoke of his labors, of Eurystheus's order, of his own guilt, and, in an unusual gesture, he didn't justify, he just explained, without asking for forgiveness, just showing what had happened. Artemis, after listening to him in silence, did not kill, did not punish. She only said, "Take her. But know this, not everything that is taken belongs to you." And she disappeared into the trees. When he arrived in Mycenae, Eurystheus didn't know what to say. He was expecting perhaps a dead prey, a body, a mistake. But there was the animal, alive, calm, with alert eyes. More than that, there was Hercules, exhausted, but intact, as resilient as a deer. This work taught another form of strength, not the strength of the blow, but the strength of holding the blow, of stopping the hand, of listening to the sound of the forest instead of breaking through it, of running the world for something that cannot be possessed, only respected, and still trying. The fifth labor brought back violence. No room for lightness, patience, or contemplation. It was time to face the Cretan bull, a furious animal, with wide eyes and paws that shook the ground. They said it breathed fire, or that the very air around it heated up when it passed. But what made this creature a threat was not its size. It was its origin. The bull came from the pride of the gods. It was a gift from Poseidon to Minos, king of Crete, with a simple purpose, to be sacrificed. But Minos, enchanted by the beauty of the animal, decided to keep it alive. This angered Poseidon, who then cursed the bull. Since then, the beast roamed Crete, destroying crops, breaking into barns, and trampling anything in its path. The king, who had refused to sacrifice it, was now not even allowed to approach it. Eurystheus, in his usual cowardice, sent Hercules to solve the problem. Capture the bull, bring it back alive. And again, there he was, a scarred man, trying to tame what no one dared to face. Reaching the island was not difficult. The wind was steady, the waters calm, but there was a strange heaviness in the air, as if the sea itself was suspicious of his mission. Hercules disembarked in silence, surveying the barren hills and low stone houses. Crete was beautiful, but harsh, the kind of place where gods tested men, or forgot them. The locals did not come near. When they heard the bull's name, they changed the subject. It was fear mixed with shame, as if the monster's very existence was a reminder of Minos's mistake, a creature that should never have been there. But that was now part of the landscape, like guilt embedded in the relief. Hercules wasted no time. He followed the trails, noticing large footprints, horn marks on trees, and broken branches. The bull did not hide. He challenged. He made noise. He drew attention. He did not run away. He looked at everything as if the whole world had offended him. And then he appeared, huge. His white fur reflected the sun. His eyes sparkled. The ground shook with his footsteps. There was no trick, no trap. It was strength against strength, instinct against instinct. Hercules waited. The bull charged. The impact was violent, horn against stone, muscle against rock. The first dodge was just barely, and the sound of the air tearing hung in the air like muffled thunder. The hero grabbed the animal by the front legs and tried to pull. He was thrown. He rolled on the ground and tasted blood in his mouth, but he got up. There was no plan, just persistence. With each new attack, he dodged, grabbed, forced the bull to retreat, not to hurt it, just to tire it out. The fight lasted for hours, an exhausting cycle of advance and resistance, until finally, the animal gave in. Its chest heaved, its eyes, once blazing, now only tired. Hercules then used thick ropes, made from local fibers, and calmly tied the animal's legs. He touched the creature's snout, and for the first time, there was no reaction. When he took the bull to Mycenae, Eurystheus looked from a distance. He ordered the animal to be released far away, where it could do no harm. He never knew what to do with the living evidence. The monsters he had captured had no place in the ordinary world, nor did he want to keep them around. But the most curious thing was the look on Hercules' face. There was no triumph, no arrogance, just exhaustion, and perhaps a kind of silent recognition. He knew the bull was not guilty of anything. It had just been pushed to a place it did not want to be, just like him. This work brought no applause, nor grand stories, only the sound of hooves being carried by the wind. And yet another night, where the hero slept with his body aching, and his thoughts even more so. The sixth labor led Hercules into a different kind of silence, one that came not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something wrong, distorted. The Stymphalian birds lived in a marshy, forgotten region, surrounded by dry trees and thick mud. They did not attack villages directly. They did not tear down walls, but they spread panic in another way, with their screams so high, so sharp, that they cut through the air like blades. And when they attacked, their metal beaks and sharp feathers left nothing intact. No one knew for sure where they had come from. Some said they had been created by Ares, the god of war. Others said they had arisen from the accumulated hatred of mankind. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, and they were multiplying. Eurystheus sent a direct message: drive them away, make them leave the region. There was no need to kill them, just clear the sky. Hercules reached the Stymphalian with his ears open. The swamp did not seem dangerous at first glance, but he soon realized that something was wrong with the surroundings. The trees were crooked, as if they had been pressed by some invisible force. The air smelled of rusty metal mixed with feces, and the sound was irregular. Long screams, punctuated by uncomfortable silences, a constant wailing coming from above. The birds did not hide. They perched, watching with shiny black eyes, almost curious. Each had long pointed beaks and dark feathers that made a sharp cracking sound when they flapped. Hercules tried to get closer. He threw stones, shouted. They just took flight and came back, mocking. The brute strategy would not work. It was then that he remembered what Athena had given him before the journey, a pair of bronze castanets made by Hephaestus. Simple objects, but with a specific sound, metallic and vibrant, something made not to hurt, but to destabilize. He climbed a nearby hill where he could see the lake and the surrounding vegetation. He pulled out his castanets and began to strike. The sound echoed like a discordant bell, an aggressive, disturbing vibration that spread through the humid air. The birds reacted. At first, restless, then disoriented. They began to call back. They flailed. They flew in circles, bumping into each other. The sound jolted them, as if breaking something inside them. Hercules continued. He knocked hard, rhythmically. The sky turned into chaos. The creatures began to flee, at first in small groups, then in flocks. They crossed the lake, passed through the trees, and disappeared over the horizon. All that was left were scattered feathers and a sudden silence. thick as stone. He stopped. He breathed. His body was still firm, but his mind full of noise because that fight had no combat. He had no sweat, no cuts, no visible pain, just sound, just repetition, just the strange force of disturbing something until it goes away. And that's when he realized this wasn't just about birds. It was about thoughts, about memories that fly around and scream endlessly, ideas that don't attack head on, but that little by little corrode. And to face them, swords won't do, or arrows. You need to find a sound that confuses, a rhythm that breaks the cycle. Upon returning to Mycenae, Eurystheus hardly commented. It was a minor task, he said. No creature captured, no test specimen, but Hercules knew it was no minor task. He knew that the hardest part, sometimes, was to keep away what no one sees. Another mission accomplished, and another lonely night, where the silence wasn't exactly calm, but at least it was his. The seventh labor didn't involve monsters, or chases, or supernatural creatures. It involved shit. Literally, the kind of task no one wanted, and that's why Eurystheus chose it. It wasn't just a way to humiliate Hercules, it was an attempt to ridicule him. If the beasts didn't kill him, perhaps the contempt would eat away at him. The order was simple. Clean King Augeas' stables in a single day. The detail? Augeas owned the largest herd in Greece, thousands of oxen and cows, and decades ago the stables had not been cleaned. It was an entire valley covered in dry, wet feces, piled up like walls. The smell could be smelled for miles. The ground was no longer soil. It was a crust of waste. And Augeas, of course, laughed at the mission. Not even he believed anyone would try. Hercules arrived in the morning. The sun was already making the air vibrate. The servants looked on with mockery. Some held their noses. Others pretended not to see. The hero did not answer. He observed the terrain. He walked between the walls of dung. He felt the weight of the task, not in his body, but in his spirit. Was that it then? From killing monsters to removing dirt. But Hercules was not offended. It was work, and work, no matter how dirty, did not scare him. The difference was that this time, strength was not enough. There was no point in digging, pushing, or dragging. It would take weeks. He needed to think, look at the problem as a sick body, and find the right spot to heal it. And that's what he did. He walked to the nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, two strong streams rushing through the hills. He studied the flow, the height, the strength of the currents, and he had an idea, a diversion. If I could redirect the rivers through the stables, the water would wash everything away. In hours, the impossible would become possible without lifting a shovel. Then, with the same force with which he had previously crushed lions, he opened canals, he broke rocks, he dug the earth, he supported them with logs. He built small dikes. The ground shook with his interventions. The landscape changed, and when everything was ready, he broke the banks. The water invaded like a scream. It came in furiously. It washed away feces, mud, urine that had accumulated over decades. It came down in thick, brown waves that swept everything away. The oxen were removed in time, but the rest turned into a torrent. In a few hours, the stables were clean, as if nothing had happened, as if decades of neglect could be erased with engineering and willpower. Augeas was shocked. He didn't find it funny. He tried to deny that the deed had any value. He said there was no agreement, that he wouldn't pay anything. But everyone saw it. Everyone knew. What was considered undignified, dirty, beneath dignity, was done, and done well. Hercules did not argue with Augeas, nor did he demand recognition. He simply left. Another task accomplished. Another humiliation transformed into a solution because, in the end, the dirt did not intimidate him. What makes things dirty is not the work, it is the lie, the denial of what needs to be done. That night, he slept near a river, the same one he had redirected. The sound of the water was now familiar. It washed away his thoughts. It washed away not only feces, but also what was stuck in his soul: doubt, tiredness, anger, and for a brief moment, very brief indeed, everything seemed clean. The eighth labor seemed like a repeat. Again, the Cretan bull. But this time, the task was not to capture it, that had already been done. Now it was to transport it, to get the living creature from Crete to Mycenae. A long, uncomfortable, exposed journey. It was like walking with an explosion on strings, and everyone was watching. Few remember this part, because there was no combat. There were no great feats, just the hero pulling a thick rope, with the bull snorting behind him, trying to escape. Over and over again, each stop was a risk, each detour a new tension. The creature would not accept being contained. It was brute force. Without understanding, a constant reminder that domination is not the same as peace. During the crossing, Hercules avoided villages. People hid when they saw the animal. Some ran away, others just watched in silence, as if they were seeing an omen passing by. Hercules himself barely ate. He slept little. He kept the bull steady, without violence, but with control, all the time. Sometimes he would just stop to breathe. In open fields, far from everything, he would watch the sky. He would feel the wind. He would try to remember why he was still doing this. Why keep going, when even after defeating a monster, all he got was more work? It was at these moments that the bull seemed different, less hostile, more tired than furious. And then he would start snorting and kicking again, as if the whole world were still an insult, and maybe it was. Upon arriving in Mycenae, Eurystheus's reaction was predictable. He hid in the bronze jar, then he ordered the bull to be released. Simple as that. Take it outside, away from the cities, out of sight. He didn't want the animal. He never did. He just wanted Hercules to bring it to him. And that's what he did. He released the bull onto an empty plain, where it ran until it disappeared over the horizon. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just another end that seemed to mean nothing. But that day, something broke, not in Hercules. That had happened before. Expectation was broken. Hope, perhaps, that any of these quests might lead to something, some recognition, some relief, because there was no reward, no meaning, only continuation. This work, almost invisible in popular versions of the story, was actually one of the cruelest, because it was empty, because nothing changed, because the only thing to be faced there was the absurdity of continuing even when everything seems useless. That night, he slept under the open sky. No fire, no words. The sound of the bull's hooves still echoing in the distance, like a reminder that strength carries, but it does not solve. The ninth labor plunged Hercules into a different kind of brutality. This was no isolated beast, no mythical animal, no force of nature. These were horses. Mares, really. They belonged to Diomedes, king of Thrace. Majestic creatures with dark fur and bright eyes, but with an appetite different. They ate meat, human flesh, and not out of hunger, out of habit. They fed on travelers, prisoners, slaves. Diomedes found this amusing. It wasn't a metaphor. It was real. The mares were carnivores, ferocious and trained to attack, and Hercules had to capture them, alive. Once again, the task was not to destroy, but to contain. And this time, what needed to be contained was a violence that had been taught, learned, tamed until it became part of the routine. Reaching Thrace was the first challenge. The borders were hostile. Diomedes did not like visitors. He greeted strangers with threats and contempt. When he heard about Hercules' mission, he laughed. He found it pathetic, a hero dealing with horses. But these were no ordinary horses. The creatures were kept in reinforced stables, with double gates and thick chains. And yet, the sound of hooves and teeth biting wood was constant, annoying, like a distant war drum. Hercules arrived unannounced. He observed first. He studied the guards, the paths, the eating habits. The servants brought in bodies at dusk. They threw pieces through the cracks. The mares went crazy. They tore, crushed, fought among themselves. It was a horrible spectacle, and everyone there acted as if it were common. That night, he acted. He invaded the stables. He faced the guards, not brutally, but with precision, silently, as if he knew what needed to be done. When he reached the mares, he cautiously opened the gates. The animals advanced, but he was prepared. He used chains, a firm voice, a dominant posture, and something beyond strength, understanding, because these creatures were not naturally cruel. They had been conditioned. They had been taught to see flesh as food, and that changed everything. Hercules held them back, not with blows, but with presence, with authority, with an energy that said, "No more." Diomedes, upon discovering the invasion, came personally, with his soldiers, proud, arrogant, armed. The fight was short. Hercules knocked him down, and, in a symbolic or perverse act, he threw the king's own body to the horses. They advanced. They tore. They ate, without hesitation, perhaps because they were hungry, or because they no longer knew how to do anything else. After that, the behavior changed. The mares became calm, as if something had ended, as if Diomedes' presence was the trigger for their savagery, and with him dead, the hunger ceased, or just changed. Hercules took the animals to Mycenae. Eurystheus, upon seeing them, trembled. He ordered them to be released into distant lands, far from any city. Once again, he did not want to deal with the outcome. He only wanted to observe the feat from a distance. This work left different marks. It wasn't about defeating a creature. It was about looking head-on at the cruelty that men teach animals, and realizing that often monsters aren't born that way. They are shaped by violence, by habit, by power. That night, Hercules did not sleep. He stayed looking at the stars, wondering if he too had been shaped, if the fury he carried was his own, or taught by everything around him. The 10th labor took him to the world of women, who refused to be tamed. The Amazons, warriors, autonomous, organized in their own society, far from the domination of men. And among them was Hippolyta, the queen, owner of a magical belt given to her by Ares, a symbol of power and legitimacy. The task? To take this belt and bring it to Eurystheus, who wanted to give it as a gift to his daughter. An empty demand, disguised as honor. Hercules set out without pleasure. There was no enemy to be contained. There was no crime to be righted. It was an ornamental, almost diplomatic mission, but like everything in his life, one mistake would be enough, and it would turn into tragedy. Getting to the land of the Amazons was not difficult. They saw him from afar. They approached cautiously. Hippolyta came first, mounted, armed, but without aggression. She wanted to understand what he was doing there. He explained, sincerely, without threats. And curiously, she listened. Hippolyta was smart, strong, but calm. She knew that Hercules was not there by choice. And even more, he knew that the belt, while important, was not everything. It was just a symbol, something that could be given if there was respect. She considered it, She said that perhaps she could hand over the belt voluntarily, not out of fear, not out of submission, but because she understood that sometimes avoiding conflict was the best way to protect what really mattered. The other Amazons didn't like it, but they respected her leadership. The conversation seemed to be moving forward, and then chaos struck, not from the Amazons, but from the Greeks themselves. Because with Hercules, there was a small group of men, followers, soldiers, observers. One of them spread a rumor. He said that Hippolyta was trying to bewitch the hero. He said that the Amazons were planning to attack them during the night. A lie, but it was enough. Tension exploded. The Amazons, sensing the hostile movement of the men, armed themselves. Spears flashed. Shields rose. The peace evaporated in seconds. And then it began. The battle was confusing, fast, and brutal. Hercules tried to contain the conflict. He shouted. He ordered them to stop, but fear had already taken over, and in the midst of the tumult, Hippolyta was hit, an arrow, coming from who knows where. She fell from her horse. She died there, in silence. When the blood spilled, the field fell silent, as if everyone had suddenly realized their mistake. It was too late. Hercules took the belt, not as a victory, but as a mourning, as a debt. The Amazons did not stop him. They were too busy mourning their queen. He left without looking back. Eurystheus received the object with joy. He did not ask how it had been obtained. He did not want detail. He simply handed the belt to his daughter and moved on to the next challenge. But Hercules felt the weight, not of the belt, but of the implicit betrayal, of the inability to prevent an unnecessary death, of seeing a chance for peace turn once again into loss. That night, in his tent, he stared at the object, so small, so useless. He thought about Hippolyta's words, her firm gaze, the choice she was about to make, and how much it had all been wasted because of a gesture of distrust. More than any monster, this work hurt him because it showed that even when everything seems under control, violence still lurks, and that sometimes the enemy is not the other. It is fear. The 11th labor was a crossing. There were no monsters lurking, no mythological creatures ready to attack, only distance. A lot of distance. The order was to seek out the red cattle of Geryon, a giant with 3 bodies joined by a common waist, who lived on the island of Erythea, beyond the ocean, where the sun sets. A herd guarded by a 2-headed dog and an armed shepherd, in a land almost off the map, a territory where fatigue was the main enemy. To get there, Hercules had to cross the Libyan desert, a sea of sand and silence. The journey was long, lonely, and absurdly hot. The days dragged on between sweat and the cutting sun. At night, the cold was intense, and thoughts came like hallucinations. There was no shade, no direction, only horizons that did not change, and a sky that weighed more than the body. It was there, under the scorching sun, that Hercules, exhausted and without protection, did something unusual. He shouted to the sky, not a shout of anger, nor of despair, a shout of exhaustion, as if asking the gods why he was still going. And right there, out of pure boredom or irony, he drove 2 stone columns into the ground, tall, straight, like a symbolic limit, a frontier between the known world and what was to come. The columns would become famous. They would later be called the Pillars of Hercules, but at that moment, they were just a gesture, stop, to the void. As he crossed the ocean to Erythea with temporary help from Helios himself, who lent him his golden boat, Hercules arrived in an inhospitable territory, a place where the wind tasted of rust and the rocks seemed to have been forgotten by the gods. There he met the shepherd, Eurytion, and his dog, Orthrus. The fight was quick, precise. Hercules wasted no energy. He killed the dog with a single blow, The shepherd tried to fight back, but he fell too, without glory, without honor, simply because he was in the way. Then he faced Geryon, 3 bodies, 3 spears, 3 shields. A warrior in triplicate, the kind of enemy that seemed to demand strategy, but there was no prolonged combat. Hercules used an arrow poisoned with the Hydra's blood. One shot, accurate, the 3 bodies fell like trees. And that was the end of the physical challenge. But the real work had not yet begun. Driving the red cattle to Mycenae was torture. The animals were restless, scattered, accustomed to the hostile climate of the island. They had to cross the ocean, the arid plains, the desert again. At each stop, they tried to escape. In each village, someone tried to rob them. On each mountain, a new distraction. Hades himself, at one point, tried to make things difficult. He sent a disguised monster to steal part of the herd. Hercules saw through the ruse. He fought, he recovered, but it all added up. There was no rest, no gratitude. Days and nights blended together. The footprints were erased by the wind, and he kept going, always, with his eyes downcast, his body aching, his hands calloused from the ropes. He no longer thought about redemption, not even about completion. He just wanted to finish, see the end of the task, any end. Upon arriving at Mycenae, the cattle were handed over to Eurystheus, who, as usual, did not know what to do with them. He ordered that the oxen be sacrificed or released. It did not matter. The important thing was that Hercules had returned, and with that, another item on the list was crossed off. But for Hercules, that labor wasn't about Geryon or monsters. It was about persistence, about carrying things that want to escape, dealing with creatures that don't understand why they're traveling, taking care of what isn't yours without knowing why. And more than anything, it was about distance, about walking, 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 and realizing that the hardest part is not the arrival, it's the journey. That night, there was no camp. Hercules slept sitting up, with his face resting on his knee, as if he had nothing left to dream about. The 12th labor had the flavor of the impossible. Hercules was tasked with fetching the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, sacred fruits that granted immortality, guarded by nymphs and a 100-headed dragon called Ladon. But it wasn't even the dragon that was the problem. It was the garden itself. No one knew exactly where it was, only that it was at the end of the world, a place where not even the gods went often. The garden belonged to Hera, and Hera, as we know, was not exactly a fan of Hercules. Sending him there was more than a test. It was a subtle trap, because the path was long, the destination uncertain, and the risk of failure enormous. Eurystheus knew, and he sent him anyway. Hercules set out without knowing where he was going. He left Mycenae and headed north, then west. He passed through cold mountains, frozen deserts, forests where no one dared to enter. Each place had a clue, a suggestion, a half-lie. That was how he found the god Nereus, sleeping by the sea, an old, slippery god who changed his shape so as not to answer questions. But Hercules held on tight. He withstood snakes, fire, water, wind, until Nereus gave in. "Seek Atlas," he said. "Only he can touch the apples." Atlas was the Titan, condemned to support the sky on his shoulders. One of the ancients, one of the defeated. He lived in isolation, standing still, his back under the weight of the firmament. Hercules found him among broken mountains and uninhabited valleys. The giant barely moved. His muscles trembled. His eyes were empty. And yet, when he heard the request, he smiled. Of course it would help, but on one condition: that Hercules hold up the sky for a while. That's all. A brief reprieve, an impossible rest. and Hercules accepted. With his feet firm, his hands raised, he took the Titan's place, and he felt it, the weight of the world. Literally, it wasn't just physical strength, it was a mental burden, existential. His entire body pressed by something that couldn't be seen, as if every thought, every memory, every guilt was there, forcing his spine, squeezing his kidneys, gritting his teeth, and there was no way to escape, nor to sit, nor to lie down. He just had to endure. Atlas, now free, walked to the garden. He dealt with the Hesperides. He tricked the dragon. He took the apples. 3, golden, perfect. He came back with them in his hands. And then he hesitated. He said he was thinking about not going back to the burden, that maybe Hercules could stay there forever. After all, he seemed fine, strong, capable. Hercules listened, silently. He didn't protest. He didn't shout. He just said, "Okay, just hold on for a moment while I adjust my cloak on my shoulders." Atlas, trusting, took back the sky for a second, and that was enough. Hercules took the apples. He thanked them and left. He left the Titan behind, once more bound by the weight of the sky. And with that, he completed another job, not with strength, not with fury, but with intelligence, and even more, with an uncomfortable clarity. Even the most powerful, when they find relief, hesitate to give it back. When he returned to Mycenae, he gave the apples to Eurystheus. The king barely looked at them. He feared their power. He ordered them to be returned to the garden. They were to be kept safe again. No one would dare to test their eternity. Hercules did not complain. He did not want immortality. He had already lived too long. That night, he looked up at the sky. He knew what it was like to carry it. He felt the weight on his shoulders that could not be seen. And he understood something simple, but cruel. Many live like Atlas, without applause, without help, holding on to everything that the world ignores. The 13th labor was a return, but not to the place. It was a return to the body itself, to the memory of the weight, because the apples had been recovered and then returned to the garden. The labor had been done, but the feeling remained, that invisible pressure on the back that did not go away with time. And now, Eurystheus gave the last challenge to descend to the world of the dead, enter Hades, and return from there with Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. It was the most symbolic of the jobs, and the most absurd, not because it was difficult, but because it required dying, or almost, going down on your own to the end of the line, talking to shadows, walking among the dead, and bringing back a creature that, by definition, should never leave. Hercules set out in silence. He told no one. He just walked. He made his way to Taenarus, in southern Greece, where there was a cave that was said to lead to the underworld. He didn't wait for signs. He didn't ask for permission. He just went in, and the light was left behind. The descent was long, spiraling, humid. The air changed. So did the sound, little by little. There were no more sounds from the world of the living, only slow drips and whispered voices that came from nowhere. It was like diving into one's own consciousness, where each step brought back a forgotten memory. Down there, time did not pass, and it didn't even matter. As he crossed the Acheron, he was met by Charon, the boatman. Charon looked at him with gray eyes and asked no questions. He simply extended his hand. Hercules handed over the coin he had brought with him. A ritual gesture, a learned detail, and the boat glided through the black waters. On the other side were the dead, thousands, maybe millions. They didn't scream. They didn't cry. They just stared, with empty eyes. Some were recognizable. Others were mere shadows. Among them, Hercules saw faces he didn't want to see. Megara, the children, faded figures, images of a time that would never repeat itself. They didn't speak. Neither did he. Because there was no dialogue there, only presence. Further on, he met Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld, beings who were neither good nor evil, just eternal. They knew about the mission, and they didn't stop him. But they imposed one condition. Cerberus had to be taken without weapons, without wounds. If he was able to control the beast with just his body, he could take it. It was fair. And so Hercules continued on to the gates of Tartarus, where Cerberus waited. The creature did not sleep. He was always alert. 3 heads that snarled in opposite directions. The body covered in scales. The tail, a living serpent. The eyes, like burning coals. He approached slowly. No sword, no shield, no speech, just presence. The dog lunged. 3 mouths open, 3 roars. Hercules waited for the right moment, and then he grabbed. A sharp, direct move. Arms around the central neck, legs firmly on the ground. The other heads bit, scratched, but he didn't let go. He held on. He breathed, and he squeezed, not to kill, but to dominate. It wasn't a struggle of strength. It was a test of endurance. Cerberus struggled. He foamed. He tried to tear pieces of him off, but little by little, the tension eased. The dog accepted and fell silent. Hercules, covered in blood and scratches, pulled the creature to the surface. The light of the living world made Cerberus flinch, but he followed, without resistance. When he saw the scene, Eurystheus had an outburst. He screamed. He ordered the dog to be taken back immediately. He didn't want that near him, not even for a second. It was too much. It was too real, and so it was done. Hercules took Cerberus back to Hades. He released him where he found him. He said nothing. He asked nothing. He simply turned his back. This work was not about victory. It was about return, about going through death. Not to defeat it, but to accept that it is always there, lurking, like a guard dog, and that sometimes you have to face it up close to keep living. That night, when he returned to the surface, Hercules didn't speak to anyone. He just sat on the ground, and for the first time in a long time, he cried. The 12th labor was complete. They were all complete. One by one, he had defeated monsters, crossed deserts, cleaned stables, visited the underworld. He had done everything they had asked, without hesitation, without negotiation. But even so, Hercules did not feel free. Eurystheus, the king who dictated his tasks, never acknowledged his redemption. He said that 2 of the labors had been invalid. The Hydra, because there had been help. The stables, because there had been cunning. Words thrown to the wind to maintain control, to prolong the punishment. Hercules listened. He did not answer. There was nothing more to discuss. Obedience had become a kind of habit, a strange addiction, and silence, a way of life. But something was changing inside, slowly, like a muscle that begins to tire. He had done more than a dozen labors. He had carried the weight of a lifetime of mistakes, impositions, and trials, and in the end, instead of relief, there was emptiness. No god had descended from the sky. No mortal had reached out. The scars were there. The deeds were there. But nothing seemed enough. Rumors were spreading in the city. Some called him a hero, others a madman. Statues were erected in his honor. Songs were composed, exaggerated, that spoke of feats he never accomplished. Each one of them took him a little further away from reality, from the truth. The Hercules of the stories was no longer him. He was someone else, a symbol, an idea, and he knew it. I walked down the street and people looked away, not out of fear, but because they didn't know how to behave in front of someone who had seen the world from the inside, someone who had survived everything. And that's why it's scary, because it proves that it's possible, but not desirable. Hercules tried to get away. He went to the countryside, far from the city. He lived for days in silence, near ancient trees. He tried to plant, he tried to care for animals, he tried to do simple things, but everything seemed strange, as if his body was still waiting for a new task, as if his soul was still on guard. And then there were the dreams. At night, the faces would come back. Megara, the children, the boar, the Amazons, Hades' hound, all of them mixed together, like a never-ending parade. He would wake up with his chest tight, his eyes dry, because there were no more tears, only memories. One day, a traveler found him. He said he had a message. From Eurystheus? No, from no one. Just random words from other lands, and they said what he already suspected. The world went on. The wars did not stop. The injustices did not cease. There were other monsters, other cowardly king, and no one asked where Hercules was, because deep down, it didn't matter. He was not offended, nor was he saddened. He simply understood, with the clarity that comes after exhaustion. The work never ends, but the body does, and he was no longer the same. He no longer carried the illusion of the mission, only the weight of what remained afterwards. That night, he sat in front of a fire. He watched the dancing flames. He thought about everything that had happened, and for the first time, he didn't try to understand it or organize it in sequence. He just let it come, a strange feeling that perhaps all of that had just been a way for the gods to occupy themselves. A distraction, as if they were playing with destiny. But there was something else, something small, that remained after the fire, after the blood, after the losses. A sense of presence, of having come through the absurd, and still being here, breathing. Not at peace, but whole, enough to carry on. The work was done, all of it, and even without recognition, without a party, without a formal ending. That was a point, a silent ending. And that, deep down, was the most that could be expected. The next morning, he got up, calmly, unhurried. He didn't know what he would do, but he knew he wouldn't do it out of obligation. Maybe, for the first time, he could choose, even if it was just the direction he would walk. With his work completed, and silence as his constant companion, Hercules continued living. But living, for him, was a kind of aftermath, like the smoke that remains after a fire. There were no plans, just simple gestures. He walked through places where no one knew him. He slept under trees. He ate whatever he found. He tried to listen to the sound of the birds, but all he heard was the echo of ancient roars, as if he were still trapped in the time of struggle. But life, even in its strange stubbornness, sometimes offers detours. That was how he met Deianira, young, firm, suspicious, not at all enchanted by stories of heroes. She looked at him as if he were an ordinary man, and that, for Hercules, was a relief. The beginning of something he could not name, a different time. They married without fanfare, without crowns, without divine blessings, only the silent promise to try. And for a while it worked. They lived in Trachis, far from the palaces, far from the memories. She took care of the house. He chopped wood, fished, fixed the roof, and for the first time in years, he laughed. Not much, but he laughed. But peace, as always, was an interval, never a destination. While crossing a river, something changed. The couple needed to cross to the other side, but the current was strong. A centaur named Nessus appeared and offered to help. He said he would carry Deianira on his back. Hercules hesitated, but the river was treacherous, and Nessus seemed trustworthy. When the two were in the middle of the river, the centaur tried to grab her. He tried to carry her away. The old impulse of conquest, of power. Deianira screamed. Hercules acted. He pulled out an arrow, one of those dipped in the Hydra's venom, and shot. Nessus fell, mortally wounded. But before he died, he whispered something to Deianira. He lied. She said that her blood Mixed with that of the arrow was a love potion, an enchantment that if she ever feared losing her husband, she would only have to soak a tunic with that blood, and he would never leave her. She believed she kept the secret, and she moved on with her life. Time passed, and with it, insecurity grew. Hercules, still respected wherever he went, was constantly harassed by promises of glory. Deianira watched from afar. She felt him distancing himself, that perhaps he was looking for another life, another woman. There was no betrayal, but there was shadow, and where there is shadow, fear is born. It was then that she decided to wear the tunic. A gift, a gesture, a mistake. He gave the garment to a messenger. He asked that it be taken to Hercules, who was on campaign. When he put it on, he began. The poison took effect. It didn't burn on the outside. It burned on the inside. His skin stuck to the cloth. His flesh burned. Every fiber of his tunic became red-hot iron. He tried to tear it off. He screamed. He tore his own skin, but it was too late. The hero, who had faced monsters, gods, Hades himself, now fell to his knees by the hand of the one he loved, not out of hate, but out of deceit. Deianira, upon learning what she had done, killed herself with the same hand that had once caressed his face. She could not bear the guilt nor the emptiness. Hercules, even in agony, understood. There was no anger, only acceptance, because deep down, he knew that this whole story could only end like this, not in battle, but in tragedy. He climbed a hill, carrying the pain as he always did. He asked for a pyre to be built, a bonfire. He lay down on it and waited. That's when Zeus, the absent father, intervened. He ordered that the fire not consume the flesh, but free the spirit, that the mortal body would remain and the immortal would rise. Hercules became a god, but what did that mean exactly? On the altars, he would be worshipped. At parties, he would be remembered. On Olympus, he would have a place among the gods. But those who lived as he did never forget the ground, the earth, the sweat, the losses. Deification did not erase the pain. It only pushed it away a little, like a cloud over the past. A hero, now eternal, but forever marked. On Olympus, all was light, gold, marble, ambrosia. The gods laughed easily. They drank to excess. They watched the mortal world as if watching a play over and over again. Always the same mistakes, always the same tragedies. And now, among them, stood Hercules, not as a visitor, but as one of them, elevated, rewarded, finally relieved, in theory. But he didn't feel that way. He was received with celebration, pomp, and applause. Hera, the same one who had persecuted him throughout his life, now embraced him with a serene and artificial expression. It was as if the whole story had been resolved with a pat on the back. He spent his days wandering the mountain. He spoke little. He laughed less. He was respected, of course, revered, but he didn't belong there. And the more time passed, the clearer it became. Olympus was too comfortable for someone who had learned to live among wounds. One day, Hermes approached, always light, quick, curious. He asked why the new god didn't smile. "You have achieved everything," he said. "Immortality, forgiveness, glory, isn't that what everyone wants?" Hercules replied with a dry sentence. "I just wanted what I lost to come back." There was no answer to that. Hermes, for once, had no words. He just waved and was gone, flying toward some other distraction. The gods did not know how to deal with regret, with doubt. Up there, everything was absolute, but for Hercules, there were still echoes. He dreamed of the voices of his children. He felt the absence of Megara, Deianira, Iolaus, those who remained in the underworld. those who did not become legends, those whom no one worshipped. He spent part of his nights looking down. He saw mortals sleeping, crying, laughing. He missed feeling cold, being hungry, making mistakes, because deep down, these were the things that made him human, that made him real. He was a god, but he could not forget the smell of the Augean stable, the taste of the dust of Erymanthus, the sound of castanets in the Stymphalian marsh. Each moment stuck to his body like an invisible tattoo. Olympus could not erase it. It only made it more distant. Once, he tried to approach Hestia, the goddess of the home, of calm. She welcomed him kindly. She served him warm bread, fig tea. They remained silent, and in that silence, there was an understanding. She did not speak of war, nor of destiny, only of the present, of the minimal comfort that can save a weary soul. It was then that he understood. Perhaps his presence among the gods was not to celebrate, but to remember that even the greatest can break, that even the children of Zeus cry, that heroism is not only about victories, but about bearing defeats without falling apart. And little by little, this became his new role, Hercules, the god who listens, who consoles, who does not judge. Mortals prayed for strength. He answered with silence and presence. Sometimes, that was all someone needed. The gods respected him, but kept their distance. He was one of them, and he wasn't. A bridge, a living scar, a reminder, and he accepted. Because after all, living as a memory was perhaps the most peace he could achieve. On that Olympus of eternities, Hercules found a strange kind of rest, not in glory, but in the interval, in the space between what was and what still resonates. Hercules' fame grew like smoke on a windless night, uncontrollable, diffuse, and ever rising. Down there, among mortals, they said he had conquered everything, that nothing could bring him down, that he was now a god among gods, untouchable, infallible. Songs sang of victories. Statues showed him with his chest puffed out, chin held high, always in a position to attack. The eternal hero, the one who never hesitated, the one who never faltered. But among everything they said, almost nothing was true. Fame created another Hercules, one who did not bleed in the desert, one who did not cry before his dead children, one who did not hesitate before Hippolyta's belt. A clean, edited Hercules. And it was this one that the people adored. The real one? He was quiet on Olympus, sitting, watching. He did not care about the cult, the rituals, the parties in his honor. He no longer sought approval, nor did he deny what he had been. But it was curious how glory always came with oblivion. The more they celebrated it, the less they remembered what it had cost. One day, he came down to earth in disguise, without announcement, without a throne. He wanted to see for himself what he had become. He passed through villages where they called him patron of strength. He saw murals that depicted him slaying monster that never existed. He saw children playing with imaginary swords, shouting his name as if they were casting a spell. And he saw adults repeating the stories, with pride, but without doubt, as if pain were a detail, as if the most important part was always the final blow. In a square, he heard a poet reciting an epic about the 12 Labors. The audience applauded, but everything sounded strange. The dialogues were grandiose, the speeches full of catchphrases. The Hydra became a simple monster, the Amazons, savage enemies, the poisoned tunic, an accident of a betrayed hero. Everything fitted together, easy to swallow, no wrinkles, no hesitation. Hercules listened to the end. Then he approached. He asked the poet if he had really met the hero. The man laughed. Of course not. He is a god. But the myth is ours. That phrase stuck. The myth is ours, not his. Not those who lived through the pain, but the peoples, the cities, the traditions, and maybe it was true. Maybe by becoming a symbol, no one would belong to themselves anymore. He returned to Olympus with tired eyes. He sat in the same corner. He continued to observe. Glory brought no relief. It brought distortion. Details became noise. Falls were erased. Fragility was rejected. And yet, even then, he understood. People need stories, endings, heroes who never fail, because life is flawed enough as it is. And sometimes a strong myth, even a false one, helps more than the sad truth. Hercules didn't try to correct anything. He didn't deny it. He didn't tear down murals. He just remained, as if he knew that there is a huge distance between being remembered and being understood. His fame continued to grow. But he, up there, knew that no name carved in stone can carry everything a man feels. In eternity, there is plenty of time, but little room for nuance. In eternity, time dissolves, but memory does not. And even with his mortal life over, even with his feet among the gods, there was something Hercules could not let go of: memory. It came not as a clear image, but as a weight, a kind of gravity that pulled from within, a question that returned again and again, silently. Who am I now? During the work, the answer was simple. It was what he did, what he fought for, what he won. It was sweat, muscle, and mission. Identity was confused with task, but now there was no task. There was no immediate pain to bear, no enemy ahead, only the echo of everything that had already happened, and doubt. He thought of his children, not those on Olympus, but those who had died at his hands. Still children, still smelling of milk, and even though the gods had said that the madness was Hera's doing, that the blood was not his fault, his body did not forget. His hands remembered, his stained clothes, his eyes that had gone out without understanding why. I also thought about Megara, who had no time to defend herself or to run away, who lived with fear in her eyes, in her last seconds, and that was worse than any monster because it was real. And he thought of Iolaus, his loyal nephew, the only one who did not fear him, who stood by his side against the Hydra, who believed he was more than brute strength. Where would he be now? Would he be remembered in history, or would he be just another name erased by the grandeur of myth? These memories did not come as punishment, but as part of what still formed him, because, despite the apotheosis, he was still, and always would be, the man who endured everything and carried everything, including doubt. In the halls of Olympus, the festivities continued, but Hercules no longer participated as he had before. He sat on the sidelines. He watched the gods toast eternally. Perfection was noisy, and he began to suspect that perhaps it was made to hide emptiness. There was a night when Dionysus approached, drunk, as always. He sat next to Hercules with a glass in his hand and said, "You don't like parties because you've seen too much, right?" Hercules did not answer, but Dionysus continued, "They think being a god is about escaping. I think it is about remembering and still getting up. That is why you are disturbing, because you know too much." It was the first time anyone there said something that made sense. Being a god, for Hercules, was not power. It was residue. It was what is left over when everything has been lost, and what is done with it. And no matter how much the world continued to sing of deeds and mold statues, he knew that his true story did not fit there, neither in stone nor in verse. The hero of mortals was an invention. The man who fought, fell, repented, and started again. He remained there, sitting, looking down at the world with downcast eyes, because he knew the value of each step. And over time, he realized that perhaps his mission now was precisely that: to be imperfect, to be the god who failed, who killed, who cried, who got lost, and who still continued. In eternity, there is room for symbols, but only humans know what it is to carry what has no solution. And in this strange space, Hercules began to feel useful again. not as a warrior, but as a living reminder that pain exists, yes, but it doesn't have to be the end. The memory was constant. There was not a day, not even in eternity, when Hercules did not feel the past knocking on his door. The 13th god of Olympus, strong as no other, continued to be haunted by something that no deity could touch: regret, a feeling without an altar, without worship, but eternal like the gods themselves. What crushed him was not only the guilt of what he had done, but of what he could never undo. The faces of the tragedy that had dragged him on this journey still appeared in the darkness. Megara, the children, the house, the life that could have been, the details, could not be erased. The sound of children's laughter, the smell of freshly baked bread, the light streaming through the window in the late afternoon, all of this came back, now and then, like a cruel gift from memory. The gods said it was all in the past, that he had already paid for it, that his labors had purified him. But Hercules knew better. Redemption is a comfortable myth. Real pain does not dissolve with effort, it just settles and returns. He wondered, every now and then, what life would have been like if Hera hadn't meddled, if the blood hadn't flowed. Would he have grown old with Megara? Would he have seen his children grow up? Would he have learned to be just an ordinary man? But there was no answer. There never is. And when the silence became too much, he would descend. He would go to the edge of Olympus, where he could see the earth, and there he would watch mortals walking back and forth, full of small worries, brief joys, discreet tragedies. And there was a beauty in that. They didn't know they were being seen. They were just living, and that just was everything. It was on one of those nights that he heard her name again. Not in a dream, in prayer. Someone, somewhere in the world, was asking him, not for force, but for forgiveness. It was a simple man, asking for forgiveness, for having yelled at his son, for having lost his temper, for having been weak. For a moment, the voice was sincere, and that touched him more than all the triumphant songs. Hercules did not respond with miracles. He just listened, and he understood that there was a new task, one that no one had given him, that was not on a list. But that was perhaps the most difficult of all, to keep listening, to be the God who knows what it is to fail, and yet does not turn his back. Over time, he began to attract different prayers, people who did not ask for victories, but for comfort, courage to try again, people who said, "I'm not strong enough," and found, in his image, not judgment, but companionship, because Hercules was not the symbol of perfection. He was the portrait of someone who makes mistakes, struggles, suffers, and continues. And that, in the end, is what life is most like. And in this new role, he found a kind of peace, one that did not come from oblivion, but from acceptance, because the past does not disappear, but it can be carried more lightly, and sometimes that's enough. There are names that time almost erases, that do not become constellations, nor have statues, but that remain alive in a hidden part of memory. For Hercules, these names weighed more than monsters, more than arrows, more than the 12 labors, because they were people, people who were left behind. Iolaus was the first to appear in this silent parade, a loyal nephew, a companion in missions, the only one who never looked at him with fear, even after seeing what he was capable of doing. Iolaus laughed at the most absurd situations. He made jokes while tying his sandals or preparing food, and more than that, he trusted. When they faced the Hydra together, Iolaus had the idea of burning the necks of the severed heads. Without him, victory would have been impossible. But in the stories told later, his name barely appears. Hercules thought about this often, how heroism is a selective construction, how only grand gestures become legend, No one sings the courage of those who support, of those who are by your side, of those who do not shine, but sustain. And there was Megara, not just his wife, not just the woman who shared a home with him. Megara was the beginning of everything that could have been normal. A life without monsters, without cowardly kings, without gods interfering. It was with her that he imagined long, peaceful days. With the smell of firewood and warm bread, it was she who made the house a home. The memory of what happened never stopped hurting. The madness imposed by Hera, the tragedy at home, the blood spilled by hands that never wanted to kill, and worst of all, the knowledge that nothing would erase it, that even if all the gods declared his innocence, he would never feel clean. He also thought about his children, 3 little ones. One of them liked to climb on his father's back and pretend he was a centaur. Another laughed just watching him lift stones. The youngest slept hugging his leg as if it were the safest place in the world. None of them had time to grow up, to make choices, to make mistakes, and go back. They were torn from the world by a force they did not understand. And, in a way, Hercules was too. These memories didn't come in order. They didn't come with a warning. Sometimes they would come when I saw a child running in a field, or when I heard a distant laugh, and then my chest would tighten, not out of anger, but out of longing for something that would never be again. On Olympus, no one spoke of such things. There, mistakes were corrected with power. Pain was ignored with wine and eternity. But Hercules was a different kind of god, one who knew regret, who knew the name of every absence. And there were more. Other faces, other names. Dejanira, who tried to love him, who believed she was helping, who fell into a trap of poisonous words. She also carried her own ghosts. And in the end, she was devoured by guilt, not by malice, but by fear, by love, by insecurity. He didn't hate her. He didn't forgive her. He just accepted her, as if every person in his life had been part of a puzzle that was never completed. That was his legacy, not just strength, but memory. And in eternity, where everything repeats itself, memory is a rare gift. Hercules knew he would never meet these people again, that the dead belong to the world from which one does not return, but keeping them alive in his thoughts was a form of respect, a way of saying, I have not forgotten. I do not carry on as if nothing had happened. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most human a god could be. Over time, fame became a shadow, and not a light shadow, but one that covers everything, distorts contours, erases details. With each generation, the figure of Hercules became more exaggerated, further from reality. Stories spread like wind through dry grass, fast, flammable, imprecise. They said he had moved mountains with his bare hands, that he had defeated 1,000 enemies in a single night, that the gods had chosen him from birth because they saw something unique in him. No one mentioned the fear, the hesitation, the doubt, the time he thought about killing himself, the time he couldn't sleep. The songs became marches, the poems, praises. On many altars, Hercules was worshipped as a symbol of perfect virility, of control, of unwavering obedience, as if he had accepted everything with pride, as if he had not cried. And he listened, sitting on the edge of Olympus, as he often did. He watched the rituals. The priests said things he had never said. They taught lessons he had never believed. They repeated formulas of strength, as if they were universal, as if anyone could simply endure everything, like he could. And that bothered him. Not because I wanted correction, but because I knew that this unrealistic image was harmful. It made people expect too much from you. It made them blame themselves for not being indestructible. It made them see weakness as a flaw, when often it was just a sign of genuine fatigue. He wanted to scream, I wasn't strong all along. I wanted to say, I was violent. I was unfair. I was destroyed inside, and I continued only because I saw no other choice. But the gods do not scream, and he had already learned that the most important truths are those that are kept silent. But that didn't stop the sadness, because the distortion of one's own story is a kind of death, one that happened slowly, layer by layer, until the face in the mirror is no longer his own. In one of the most devout cities, he saw a new statue being erected. It showed him holding the sky with one arm, smiling. The people applauded. They said it was the portrait of absolute resistance. But he knew that on that day, with the weight of the firmament on his back, there was no smile, only pain, only effort, only an urgent desire to be forgotten for a few minutes. That was the problem with fame. It chooses what to show, and it almost never chooses what really matters. There were many trials that didn't become history. The small decisions, the days when nothing happened, but he still didn't give up. The moments when he held back his anger, or admitted his mistake, or forgave those who hurt him. These things don't sell well, they don't impress, but, paradoxically, they are the ones that most define who you are. Hercules thought about this as he watched a child praying at the feet of his image. She asked for courage, but her voice trembled. It was not courage to fight, it was courage to keep living, to not run away, to put up with a sick father, a tired mother, and endless poverty. He listened, and he wanted to respond. Don't try to be like me, be like you. With your pain, with your hope, with your limits. That is more than enough. But once again, it just stayed present, like a shadow in reverse. Not to hide, but to remember. The glory now seemed small, the forgetfulness of the truth immense, but he was still there. Not as an example, but as someone who saw everything, did everything, lost almost everything, and still kept listening. Between one prayer and another, between the retold stories and the empty rituals, Hercules remembered not the celebrated feats, but the trials that never made it into the books, the ones that no one sang about, the ones that had no audience, the ones that didn't seem big enough to become legends, but that, secretly, were the most difficult. There was, for example, that night in the middle of the Libyan desert between the 10th and 11th labor. No animals to fight, no cattle to drive, just solitude. The wind cut his face as if it had claws, and he, exhausted, lay down on the hard ground, hungry, feverish, not knowing if he would be able to continue. No one saw him. No one told him. But it was there that he almost gave up. There, without a monster, without an enemy, he was overcome by the simple exhaustion of existing. There was also that time he held a boy, so he wouldn't die of fever. During a crossing, he came across a sick village. He stopped. He stayed. He collected water. He did what he could. The boy survived. He grew up. But that never made it into the story, because it wasn't heroic enough, because it didn't involve strength, just care. And there were times when he had to apologize. To a peasant, for accidentally breaking his plow. To a woman, for entering the wrong house while hunting. To a young hunter, for taking credit for a kill that wasn't his. Small humiliations, small amends, things that fame can't handle. Because myth doesn't ask for humility, but the man needed it. These tests were not among the 12, but they demanded just as much, sometimes more, because there is no glory in keeping your composure when you are afraid. There is no audience when you hold back your tears in the middle of the night. There are no songs about turning back, but these are the real battles. And Hercules, more than a warrior, was a survivor of them. He often remembered the look on Diomedes' face, seconds before he was thrown to his own carnivorous mares. It wasn't a look of terror or hate. It was of exhaustion, a glimpse of someone who knew that this was somehow coming, not by fate, but by consequence. He remembered the first time he had thought about not following Eurystheus's order, when the king had ordered Hippolytus' belt to be brought back, and everything inside him said, "This is wrong." But even so, he went, he obeyed, and the result was blood. These memories came back not to punish, but to remind us that obedience is often a form of escape, that following orders is not the same as doing the right thing, that sometimes saying no is the hardest work, and the gods don't want to hear that. They prefer the myth. They prefer Hercules, who can handle everything, who doesn't think, who doesn't feel. A puppet strong enough to hold up the sky, but too mute to criticize the person who made him hold it up. He knew it, and he accepted it, but he carried each of these hidden proofs with care, as if they were seeds, because perhaps one day someone would need them, a mortal, lost, thinking that he had failed because he was not strong all the time. And then, perhaps, he would feel there, between prayers and doubts, the presence of a God who had also failed, who also wanted to give up, who also needed to ask for forgiveness. These hidden evidences were his true inheritance, and no one could erase that. After the labors, after the statues, after the apotheosis, there was a time when Hercules tried, sincerely, to start over, far from Olympus, far from the altars, in a discreet corner of life. It was in this space that he met Deianira, and for a brief time, he almost believed that he could be just a man again. She was different from Megara, not stronger, not more beautiful, just different. Where Megara was a restrained laugh, Deianira was a direct word. Where Megara cared in silence, Deianira asked, insisted, challenged. She was alive in a way that hurt because she remembered that there was still a world beyond the pain. They got married without mythology, without omens, without blessings from the gods, just two bodies, trying not to repeat old mistakes. Hercules tried to be less impulsive, less abrupt. He carried firewood. He was silent when she asked him to be. Deianira, in turn, tried not to fear his past, not to question it so much, not to look at the scars as threats. There were good days, but fame was a shadow. Even from afar, it reached them. There were always those who remembered. There were always those who approached to tell stories, exaggerate feats, ask about monsters. And with that came fear. Deianira smiled, but inside, she trembled, because she knew that the man before her was also the same one who had destroyed an entire family without knowing it. And then Iole appeared, young, beautiful, curious. Hercules found her during a trip. He wasn't looking for her. He didn't want to. But her presence messed something up, not because there was betrayal, but because there was a tension. And Deianira noticed. There was no fight, just distance, small, silent, but visible. He returned home with the scent of another world on his skin, and she, not knowing how to deal with it, remembered the centaur Nessus, of the gift left behind from that safety vial, from the blood mixed with hydra venom, from the words spoken by a dying enemy. If he ever forgets you, use this. And she did. She wet her tunic, not out of revenge, but out of desperation, out of fear of losing the last bit of life that still seemed stable to her. When Hercules put on the tunic, the poison woke up, not all at once, but in waves. His skin began to burn, then to burn, then to scream. He tried to tear it off, but it stuck, like ancient guilt, like a lie discovered, like love turned to punishment. He fell. He rolled on the ground. He tore his flesh. He hit rocks. He screamed names he didn't even remember, all in vain. When she found out what she had done, Deianira killed herself, not just out of guilt, but because she couldn't bear having tried to love and, in the end, destroyed herself again. Like Megara, like the others, like everyone else, Hercules, in his last moments as a man, understood. There was no anger, no curse, only acceptance, because deep down, he always knew he would not be spared, that the past would take its toll, not with a monster, but with a small, trembling gesture from someone who just wanted to hold him for a little longer. This was the last human pain, the last mortal loss, and perhaps the cruelest. Because it didn't come from the war, it came from love. The pain was long, slow, a fire that started under the skin and spread to the bones. The poisoned tunic did not kill quickly. It was as if I wanted to teach something before the end, and Hercules, accustomed to direct blows, to clean combat, discovered there a new form of agony, one that cannot be overcome with force, that cannot be pushed away with one's arms. The body burned, and with it came the memories, not in order, not logical, just flashes, the cradle and the serpents. The music interrupted by fury, Megara smiling as she prepared dinner, the Hydra swamp, the mud sticking to her feet, the arrow that killed Nessus, the moment when Deianira placed the tunic in the messenger's hands, and above all, her face, not one of fear, nor one of jealousy, but the face of someone who tried to love the man who was left after all the work, tried to build something among the ruins, and failed. As everyone fails, sooner or later, Hercules climbed Mount Oeta. Slowly, without glory, his body was giving out. The poison now seemed to have reached his bones. He could feel his legs shaking, his heart slowing down. But there was one thing he could still do. Decide how it would end. He ordered a pyre to be built, dry wood, neatly stacked. He said few words. He thanked those who had helped him. He asked them to step aside. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want anyone else dragged into his pain. He lay down on the wood. The sky was open above him. The smell of resin was in the air. And then, with the help of Philoctetes, who would have his own story later, he lit the fire. The flames began timidly. Then they grew. And with them, the body burned. But there was no longer just a man there. What was burning was also a symbol, a legend, a burden. And it was then that Zeus intervened, the Father, the God, the absent one. He commanded that the body not be consumed, that the fire should liberate, but not destroy, that the mortal part should dissolve into the air, and the divine part should rise. To heaven, to Olympus, to eternity. Hercules became a god. But what did that mean? There was no joy. There was no revelation. Just the strange sensation of going on, of breathing without lungs, of seeing without eyes, of carrying everything, even without a body. In his new form, he was received with celebration. Hera, curiously, now accepted him, perhaps tired of her own persecution, or perhaps because the gods, deep down, like statues, more than people, he was placed among the immortals. He gained a place, a name, a function. But he didn't feel different. He was the same, only lighter, only further away. Deification was not a reward. It was a kind of medicine, a forced rest, a separation from the world he had known so closely. And yet, he didn't feel superior or special, just present, observing the world with different eyes, seeing the pain that continues, the struggles that repeat themselves, the losses that no one sings about. And in the midst of it, perhaps he understood that his story, whole, imperfect, contradictory, was useful, not as a model, but as a mirror. Hercules became a god, but he never stopped being someone who fell, who loved, who failed, who tried, and maybe that was what mattered most. On Olympus, there was too much light, and yet, to Hercules, everything seemed a little hazy, The apotheosis, that moment so celebrated by gods and men, was not an end, it was a displacement, a kind of golden exile. He now existed on another plane, yes, but without entirely belonging to it. He was accepted, honored, even worshipped, but always as a symbol, never again as a person. Zeus welcomed him as a son. Hera accepted him as an ally. The gods invited him to banquets, toasting him as the man who conquered humanity itself. But Hercules knew that this was just part of the eternal drama of Olympus. There, no one really wanted to know. No one asked how it was. What hurt the most? What remained? He attended the parties in silence. He ate little. He drank slowly. He watched the exaggerated laughter of Dionysus, the endless debates between Athena and Hermes, the eternal flirtations of Aphrodite. Everything there was grand and profoundly empty, because none of them had gone through what he had gone through. None of them knew what it was to lose without guilt, to win without meaning, to live without choice. Divinity did not bring forgetfulness, it merely increased clarity. Now, with eyes that saw everything, he understood more fully what he had previously only felt. He realized how each of the 12 labors had not only been physical, but symbolic, how each mission was, in fact, a part of the soul being tested, bent, burned. The Nemean lion, the lesson of brute force against the invulnerable, the need to find a solution with your own hands, literally. The Hydra, the thoughts that multiply every time you try to cut one down. The Erymanthian boar, the fight against impulse, the need to not kill what can be controlled. The doe, respect for what should not be possessed. The bull, the anger of others that no one else wants to deal with. The birds of the Stymphalion, the mind polluted by internal noise. The stables, the cleaning of that, which everyone ignores, until it boiled. The mares of Diomedes, the violence fueled by ourselves. The belt of Hippolyta, the price of distrust. The cattle of Geryon, the weight of unrewarded persistence. The apples of the Hesperides, wisdom exchanged for cleverness. And Cerberus, the final confrontation with death itself. Now he saw all this clearly, but this clarity, far from relieving him, only made him more silent, because there is not much to say when one understands that suffering was not a punishment, but a process. The apotheosis was not the apex, it was the closing of a cycle, not because everything was resolved, but because there was nothing left that needed to be proven. Not to others, not to yourself. What remained was contemplation, subtle, silent work, existing as a living reminder of imperfection. While the gods were busy with eternity, Hercules stood on the sidelines. He received the prayers of mortals, those for courage, those for forgiveness, those for weariness, and with them he did not offer miracles, but presence, because sometimes that is enough, knowing that someone up there understands what hurts down here, not for having read it, but for having lived it. And that was the new job, not asked, not imposed, just natural. Be the God who listens, to be what you haven't forgotten. We finally reach the silence that closes the cycles, the last part, and, curiously, without a real end, because the story of Hercules, like all stories that touch us deeply, does not end. It just changes pace. In the world of men, his name continued to echo. It passed from mouth to mouth, from verse to verse, crossing centuries like an ancient sound. Some remembered his strength, others his works, others only his name. Used to sell statues, medicines, theories, and so the myth grew, while the real man was erased. But on the calmest nights, when no one sings, no one speaks, no one demands, it is possible to hear what remains. This is when the image of Hercules comes closest to the truth, not as a hero, nor as a god, but as someone tired, someone who endured more than he should have, who did what he was told, who tried to love again, and who, even after everything, still listens, still observes, still is there. He has no altar for this. There are no rituals that invoke patience, repentance, or silence, but it is in these moments, the simplest, the most human, that his presence manifests itself. When someone fails but tries again, when someone holds on to sadness without knowing what to do with it, when someone says, "I'm not strong enough," and still keeps going. It is there that the spirit of Hercules still lives, not to guide, nor to save, but to remind us that this is part of life, that survival is also a form of victory. On Olympus, he remains, a little apart, a little absent, but whole, carrying memories, like someone holding a cape, not with pride, not with shame, just with care. Sometimes the gods call him. They ask for advice. They laugh with him. They pretend to understand, but he knows they don't. And that's okay. Not everything needs to be understood. It just needs to be lived. And you, who have listened this far, may have felt this too, that the story was less about monsters and more about resistance, less about struggles and more about weight, less about glory and more about memory. Maybe you listened like someone listening to an old tale, but maybe, somewhere, you recognized yourself in a gesture, in a doubt, in a loss. And if that's the case, that's fine, because that's what it was. Not a lesson, but a company. Hercules had no peace in life, nor enough recognition, nor the end he deserved. But he had continuity. He had presence. And now, perhaps he has helped you sleep, or at least breathe a little better. And with that, we conclude. Slowly, no rush, no grandiose morals, just the feeling that, in the end, some stories continue, even after the lights go out. Good night, rest, and when you wake up, take with you not the strength, but the memory that you continue. And that's already a lot.